welcome to everybody, and I admire your stickability in sticking with us to lecture 3. In our second lecture last week, we looked at where the churches are currently in their understanding of the environmental crisis and how there is perhaps more convergence in thinking than at any time since the Great Schism of 1054. In this lecture, we will examine critically how the Western world is responding to the crisis and some of the moral dimensions of that. This evening, we ask the perhaps, in inverted commas, heretical question: are the headline-grabbing approaches adopted by many organisations, such as setting net zero targets to be achieved at some time in the future, really effective, or do they just shift the problem around, making our problem a problem for people in other parts of the world or for our children and grandchildren? When I started in the environmental science department at the University of Bradford in 1979, I embarked on a series of careers where transdisciplinarity was the norm and where people from very different backgrounds discussed challenging problems from many different angles. For instance, as a biologist, I started having conversations with economists with interests in a variety of aspects of the environment, such as nature conservation and forestry. You will perhaps see that background reflected in this lecture as I skip gaily from discipline to discipline in trying to get an understanding of what's actually going on in our response to the challenges of the environmental crisis. It was also in that coffee room that I first heard the term greenwashing. That is, doing something which on the surface looks environmentally responsible, but in reality is not, and sometimes quite the reverse. Many organisations are very accomplished at greenwashing, and it is a constant danger in making real progress. The person who regularly used this term was a land economist whose research was about how you place a value on such things as nature reserves or sites of special scientific interest that don't deliver any form of tangible return on investment but do require resources to maintain and develop and have an opportunity cost for landowners and developers who are restricted in how they can make money from those areas. These things, I later discovered when working in the field of knowledge management, are termed intangible assets. They are many and varied, and you may be surprised to know that you all have many of them. For instance, the knowledge and expertise that you have in your heads are valuable things that you take away with you from wherever you work, and actually they are very difficult to leave behind you even if you want to. At a conference some time ago, I was introduced in a session that I was speaking at by someone who I had never met and lived on the other side of the world as an iconoclast. In this case, not someone who destroys icons and other images or monuments for religious or political reasons, but someone who challenges cherished beliefs on the grounds that they are erroneous or pernicious. You might perceive something of that in what follows. This is not simply challenging prevailing orthodoxy for the sake of it, but our task in these lectures is to try to discern what Christian theology and teaching can contribute to formulating a moral and just response to the immense environmental challenges our world faces. What should we, as followers of Christ, be doing? Because, as we established last time, science and technology alone cannot solve the environmental crisis that they created. The solution to the environmental crisis is not a matter of science, technology and politics, but also, and perhaps primarily, a matter of radical change of mind, of new values, of a new ethos. When we start to look for solutions to environmental issues, it is very easy to adopt too narrow a focus. and attempt to reduce the environmental impact of one isolated factor, and in the process increase the impact of another. As Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si, to seek only a technical remedy for each environmental problem which comes up is to separate what is in reality interconnected and to mask the true and deepest problems of the global system. Let's take an example. Gordon Brown, the UK Chancellor, introduced a tax incentive for people to switch to diesel cars in 2001 as part of the UK's response to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide. The rationale was that they emit less carbon dioxide than petrol cars, are more efficient, and produce less carbon monoxide and unburnt hydrocarbons. The move was entirely focused on reducing carbon dioxide emissions, but what has since become clear is that diesel engines not only emit more nitrogen oxides, but also more particulates, both of which have proved particularly harmful to health in urban areas. So let's have a look at the Kyoto Agreement and carbon trading. The start of this particular approach is the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997 at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and committed industrialized countries and economies in transition to limit and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with agreed individual targets. Part of this approach was emissions trading, as set out in Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol, which allows countries that produce lots of polluting emissions of, say, carbon dioxide, to sell their extra emissions to countries that produce very little. Therefore, in the terminology of the protocol, these low polluters have emission units to spare. That is, emissions that they are permitted to make, but don't, to sell this excess capacity to countries that are over their targets. Emission trading is an approach to trying to limit climate change by creating a market with emitters having a limited allowance to emit. The intention is that it will have the effect of lowering the competitiveness of fossil fuels against greener alternatives and accelerate investments into low carbon sources of energy such as wind and solar power. As you'll be aware, it is fossil fuels that are considered to be the main driver of climate change, accounting for nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions and nearly 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Now, emissions trading works by setting a limit on the total emissions produced by all participating emitters. As a result, the market automatically adjusts the price to achieve this target. This is the main advantage of this approach over a fixed carbon tax, where polluters would pay a specific amount for each tonne of carbon dioxide that they produce. Now, under emissions trading, a polluter having more emissions than their quota has to purchase the right to emit more. Conversely, those with fewer can sell their spare right to emit carbon to others. And emissions trading and carbon taxes are therefore the most common methods for countries as they try to meet their pledges under the Paris Agreement of 2015 at the UN Climate Change Conference COP21. Thus, a new commodity was created in the form of emission reductions or removals. It wasn't restricted to actual emission units. Various other things, intangible assets, can also be traded and sold under the Kyoto Protocol's emissions trading scheme. For instance, a removal unit on the basis of land use change and forestry activities. an emission reduction unit generated by a joint implementation project, a certified emission reduction generated by development of a mechanism or technology for a clean alternative to one that produces emissions. Are you starting to feel that this looks all rather circular? Transfers and acquisitions of these units are monitored and recorded through registry systems under the Kyoto Protocol with international transaction logs to ensure secure and accurate transfer of emission units of various kinds between countries. Developing nations are not bound by targets in the Kyoto Protocol, and some of these, such as China and Brazil, are industrial economies. Some developed nations, including the United States, Canada and Russia, have not agreed to emissions targets, and since 1997, greenhouse gas output has increased rather than decreased. Carbon emissions trading systems for internal trading have been set up in China, the European Union, and a number of other countries. However, they are usually not harmonised with the defined carbon budgets required to maintain global warming below critical thresholds of, say, 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees, and the existing schemes cover only a limited scope of emissions and a limited range of countries. The EU-wide scheme concentrates on industry and large power generation and leaves the design and introduction of additional schemes for transport and private consumption to the member states. Though units are counted in tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, other potent greenhouse gases such as methane or nitrous oxide from agriculture are usually not included. Apart from that, an oversupply leads to low prices of allowances with almost no effect on fossil fuel combustion. Today, emissions trade allowances have widely differing prices in the different markets, ranging from about €7 a tonne in China's national carbon market to €63 a tonne in the European Union. And latest estimates suggest that the social cost of carbon emissions suggest that damage of more like €3,000 per tonne would be realistic. The true cost of environmental damage is something to which we will return. It is also worth noting that under the Kyoto Protocol, the emissions belong to the organisation or country that actually generates them, rather than one that benefits from the use of the product or the commodity. So to take a hypothetical example, if country G produces a car which is then sold in country UK, for use in that country, the emission counts to country G's tally. So as country UK gradually loses most of its manufacturing capacity, although it has to buy in goods from elsewhere, its green credentials improve markedly. This is one of the quite perverse behaviours that systems of targets and scopes produce in many and varied contexts, including education and healthcare outcomes, as well as emissions targets. Just as a slightly tongue-in-cheek aside, under the scoping of the Scottish Episcopal Church's net zero strategy, I could achieve net zero in my congregations by closing the churches that we own and inviting the members of the congregations to travel to my house from all over my 2,000 square mile patch. The logic goes like this. Heat and light energy emissions in churches belonging to the SEC are included, they're in scope 2, but since we own our own home, these are not, being in scope 3. The transport energy emissions for clergy travel are included in scope 2, but those of congregational members are not. That means in order to meet the target of net zero, I provide the warm venue and my congregations travel to me. As you can see, There are a number of problems and anomalies in the current systems of carbon trading, and it is not yet entirely clear if it actually does produce a significant, if any, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, or if it is simply an elaborate system of greenwashing that, behind the detail, hides what is actually going on through what I suppose, and I might annoy accountants in saying this, through creative accounting practices. According to the Climate Change Committee, an independent statutory body established by the UK government under the Climate Change Act of 2008, whose purpose is to advise the UK and devolved governments on emissions targets and report on progress made in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and preparing for and adapting to the impacts of climate change, businesses are increasingly turning to voluntary carbon offsetting as they aim to reach net zero. But recent market growth is premature. Offsets can mask insufficient efforts from firms to cut their own emissions, and they may push out other environmental objectives in the rush to capture carbon. The Climate Change Committee has reviewed the evidence on the impact of voluntary carbon markets and offsetting. Their current shortcomings can be overcome with stronger governance to ensure high integrity carbon credits and clearer guidance for businesses to encourage them to cut their own emissions first and foremost before turning to offsets. Many businesses have named ambitious net zero dates, but achieving them through an over-reliance on offsets is undermining the economy-wide transition. The development of a clearer definition of a net zero business in the UK will help businesses pursue a strategy that complements the national targets, prioritising action to cut emissions ahead of offsetting. Globally, voluntary carbon markets can also help to pay for nature recovery or more permanent forms of engineered greenhouse gas removal technologies, but prices would need to increase considerably to be effective, and it's unlikely that offsets alone can fill the funding gap. So there you have it. That is the body that is overseeing the UK's response in these matters. There are two ways to measure emissions: those produced directly within a particular locality, that is, territorial emissions, and those produced by consumption of within a particular locality, consumption emissions. Some have criticised the UK and other countries for focusing almost entirely on territorial emissions. These are the basis for the UK's net zero target and also what countries are required to submit to the United Nations. So another way to achieve net zero is, as we saw earlier, to have most of your goods produced in other countries so that the manufacturing emissions don't count towards your country's total. No wonder the climate activist Greta Thunberg has accused our government of creative carbon accounting. They are falling short by not considering how to reduce emissions both inside and outside the UK. This is one form of offshoring carbon dioxide emissions, though there are a number of other ways in which emissions can be added to another country's account rather than appear on your own balance sheet. This was highlighted when Conservative MP John Redwood made this remark about Germany on BBC's Radio 4 Today programme. It's only going to work if Germany, which puts out twice as much as we do, starts to take the issue seriously and closes down its coal power stations. What he was failing to take account of was the fact that much of the difference was made up by a difference in population size between the UK and Germany, and the fact that we import far more manufactured goods from Germany than they do from us. In their paper Carbon Trading and Justice, Lejano et al. Show the potential for carbon trading to create spatially inequitable patterns with emissions concentrated in already highly impacted communities when they write, "This flies in the face of the notion that carbon is a polluter that mainly has global but not local impacts. But when other things are traded along with carbon, there is potential for the creation of air toxics hotspots, along with the agglomeration of other negative impacts such as noise, dust, diesel, traffic, and others. This pattern is important. The right to emit more carbon can carry with it inherently the opportunity to increase other noxious activities as well. To put it more plainly, it is never just carbon that is being exchanged." Their paper illustrates just one aspect of the argument that carbon trading can produce unanticipated inequities. But they also point out that carbon trading can concentrate carbon emissions in a particular area. And we have seen the effect of concentration of pollution in cities across the UK ever since the Industrial Revolution. The polluting industries tended to be close to the centre of the city, and given the prevailing wind in the UK from the west, the workers in the industries were accommodated in the east of the city, whilst the middle classes and the owners of the industrial enterprises lived in the west. The result was that the air quality which the workers in the East End experienced in their lives, both at work and at home, was significantly poorer and more damaging to their health than the managers and owners that lived in the West End. It will be interesting to see if the low emission zone in Glasgow city centre, which comes into force next month, will significantly improve the air quality in the city centre, and what effects it has on the surrounding areas. Now, emissions trading is just one way of very many in which we export our environmental problems. A practice to help reduce environmental damage, which many people engage with conscientiously, is to recycle as much of their rubbish as possible. Although this is then collected by councils, what actually happens to it is rather less clear. Councils frequently sell the waste on to recycling companies, many of which only sort waste and then sell it on again, often via brokers, and a great deal of it finds its way overseas. The UK exports large quantities of plastics to other countries, including Turkey, Egypt and Malaysia, as China figured out what was going on and stopped importing waste in January 2018. The countries I mentioned lack the facilities to recycle their own plastics, let alone plastics from elsewhere. Little wonder that most plastics Turkey promises to recycle have to actually be burned or dumped. And sadly, many of our environmental problems are being dumped on other countries, often in less developed parts of the world, and this approach by the developed world is unjust, unethical, and in our earnest desire to do our bit to address the environmental and climate crises, we are all becoming ever more complicit in it. To change tack a little and introduce something at least faintly religious back into the discussion. Martin Luther was a pious and well-educated monk in Germany at the beginning of the 16th century, who eventually became professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. While studying Paul's letter to the Romans in preparation for a series of lectures in 1515, Luther had a spiritual breakthrough that represented a radical departure from church doctrine. This led Luther to conclude that salvation was a gift from God to man based on a person's faith, not his works. Salvation, therefore, did not require the intervention of the church or partaking of its sacraments, so the church was essentially unnecessary. All of that is, of course, a gross oversimplification. According to popular tradition, on the 31st of October 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. These were intended to serve as a basis for reform of the Roman Catholic Church and arguably started the Protestant Reformation in Europe. The Theses focused on two main points. The first is that the Bible, not church leadership, is the true authority for Christians. The second is that people obtain salvation through their faith rather than through their actions or good works. Specifically, Luther's document addresses the sale of letters of pardon, usually referred to as indulgences. He states every truly repentant Christian has a right to full remission of penalty and guilt, even without letters of pardon. Essentially, when the church leaders needed to raise funds for something, they didn't have a jumble sale or a coffee morning. They sold indulgences, which offered sinners an amelioration from divine punishment for their sins. An indulgence supposedly shortened the time a sinner would have to spend in purgatory after death, paying for his sins before proceeding on to heaven. In other words, there was a cash alternative to time in purgatory. Luther felt that selling indulgences was an immoral and corrupt practice, although it was widely accepted and endorsed by the Church and beyond. Frederick III of Saxony, who had founded the University of Wittenberg, had been given permission to sell indulgences to help fund the construction of a bridge. There seemed to be no bounds to this practice as far as entrepreneurial church leaders were concerned. Take, for instance, the Dominican priest Johann Tetzel, who travelled to Wittenberg in 1517 to sell indulgences for the Roman Catholic Church. The proceeds were to be used to renovate St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Tetzel even went so far as to tell buyers of his indulgences that they no longer needed to repent for their sins, and also that indulgences could be bought for dead relatives. All of this was totally abhorrent to Luther, and it was this latest example that spurred him to take action. From a moral point of view, I would suggest that carbon offsetting is simply a reinvention of that which Luther was so exercised about in 1517. Buying off an environmental sin by doing environmental good works. However, in this case, that sin is being planned meticulously in advance, and a measured amount of good works are undertaken to compensate for the harms anticipated. Though as well, these are rarely in any sort of balance. Now, there are a number of aspects of this that are morally troubling, but the one that stands out is that the people indulging in this practice are making their positive environmental contribution conditional on their doing environmental harm. Doing such good works is admirable. I have planted trees myself. Unless, of course, one is only doing them because one wishes to undo them again in the near future. From a scientific point of view, the practice of offsetting is trading in only one aspect of the harm that the offsetter is doing, namely carbon dioxide emissions, and ignores all the other environmental harms that the action of flying, cruising, etc. may do. Something largely ignored also in the Tony Blair Institute report referred to last time. Interestingly, this similarity between offsetting and indulgences has been identified by economists and business ethicists for some time. Mandalaki and O'Sullivan set out the objective of their paper thus: we will typically find that while organisations engage in wrongdoing, they also engage in right doing, often with a view to compensating in some typically unspecified way for their wrongdoing. The purpose of this conceptual paper is to bring a new perspective to understanding the somewhat paradoxical organisational behaviour. We suggest that by drawing in an analogical manner on the ancient Catholic conception of proper indulgences and abuses of indulgence, we can develop a fruitful way to understand compensatory right-doing activity, as well as a powerful normative tool for morally assessing such activity. Goodin strikes a perhaps slightly more theological note when he writes, many environmentalists, of course, would take a vaguely spiritual attitude towards nature. For them, the analogy between the sacrilege of selling nature's benefice and that of selling God's grace might be felt particularly powerfully. It would be wrong, however, to think that this analogy literally works only by implicitly or explicitly giving environmental values a spiritual twist. Goodin then goes on to discuss the moral issues concerning selling what is not yours to sell, selling that which cannot be sold, rendering wrongs right, and making wrongs all right and indulging some but not all of them. At the heart of this is who owns the right to forgive pollution. Just as Luther asks who owns the right to forgive sins. Would it be too radical to suggest that the answer to both is the same? God? Governments, however, are the ones that make money from any penalties for forgiveness in relation to pollution, taxes, or licences to pollute, and Glasgow City Council are the ones that will profit from people entering the low emissions zone when they shouldn't. For some, it is a way to print money, rather like local authority parking charges or fines for littering, speeding, or driving a non-compliant car in a low emissions zone. One of the recurring themes in historical opposition to the selling of religious indulgences, even by popes, was that they were selling that which was not truly theirs to sell. The item being sold was God's grace, His forgiveness. It was not for earthly authorities to make money from doing it on God's behalf. This argument is important in any objection to selling indulgences for violations of the physical integrity of the natural world. As Goodin says, it would be simply presumptuous of any human agents to grant indulgences on behalf of Mother Nature. Forgiveness is the prerogative of the party who has been wronged. Do we not have stewardship responsibilities both towards nature and toward future generations and their interests in the natural environment? As stewards, we are not entitled to sell environmental indulgences in much the same way and for much the same reason. It would be selling something that is not ours to sell, permitting people to destroy that which we are duty-bound to preserve, either for its own sake or for the sake of future generations. Many people may be tempted to the view that all that is happening is that the polluter at least pays something in terms of reparation. But as Goodin points out, that is to set up polluter paying against the alternative that the polluter pollutes but doesn't pay. One might argue that in the commercial world, whilst this is not the ideal alternative, perhaps it is better than nothing. I would argue, from the point of view of Christian theology, that the morally appropriate alternative should be that the polluter doesn't pollute, and the argument that paying is better than nothing is in many ways a capitulation to an already morally questionable system. Goodin writes, suppose, however, the alternative in view was instead that polluters desist from polluting altogether. Then a rule that the polluter pays looks to be the relatively more permissive option. If absent the option to pay, the alternative is that people not pollute, then giving them permission to pollute upon payment is actually a mechanism for allowing more pollution than would otherwise occur. Seen in that light, many of us may well hesitate to endorse the polluter pays principle that, in the other light, looked relatively attractive. There has been quite an emphasis on dealing with climate change by changing technologies in relation to energy use. Use electricity instead of gas for heating and electricity instead of petrol or diesel for transport. There is an underlying assumption that this will improve things. Given the fact that manufacture and disposal of goods can consume large quantities of energy and other resources, and may result in considerable other forms of pollution, it does not follow that dumping one type of car, washing machine, or other appliance that is more polluting to use and acquiring one that is less polluting to use results in an environmental improvement. There is, after all, one to dispose of and another to be manufactured. The environmental impact of such decisions can often be finely balanced and therefore should be based on the full impact of the change rather than just one element of it. It is questionable whether car scrappage schemes contribute anything other than environmental damage when all aspects are considered. In such circumstances, reduced use of a more polluting item might contribute rather less environmental harm than replacing it with a less polluting one, but continuing to use it as before. Replacement tries to minimize the behavioral change required in order to achieve the holy grail of net zero. But we continue to do exactly the same thing, just using electricity rather than fossil fuels. In this understanding of the problem, we can feel good about ourselves and our activities as we perceive that the environmental effect is eliminated, in much the same way that some advertising of vegetable-based spreads a couple of decades ago suggested that these were actually good for you, rather than perhaps being a little less bad than butter itself. Even if the technology substitution solution might sound superficially attractive, any serious examination of it reveals that it doesn't even deal with the problem at a technology/scientific level, let alone ushering in changes in behaviour or addressing matters of ethics or ethos that are so essential to tackle a much deeper and wider problem. As I said last time, part of getting on track to a more sustainable future is not simply getting public policies right, inventing new technologies and changing consumer behaviour, all of which are without doubt necessary, but must also entail changing how we value the natural world. Remember also that Zizioulas suggested in his series of lectures at King's College London that ethics or rules are not the answer either. The solution lies at a deeper, more spiritual level, he writes. Appealing therefore only to the ethical solution, as so many Christians seem to do today, would only reinforce the reasons that led to the ecological crisis in the first place. We try to solve the ecological problem by introducing new ethical values or rearranging the scale of the traditional ones. I fear that we shall not go very far in reaching a solution. As an aside, during my training for ministry a little over a decade ago, we visited an eco-church where they proudly told us that amongst other things, all the 300 light bulbs in the building were low energy. What seemed perhaps slightly less clear to our very welcoming hosts was that having rather fewer turned on, especially during the day, might actually save even more energy. Returning to offsetting in a slightly oblique way, it is one of a number of ways for individuals, organisations and governments to work towards achieving this holy grail of net zero. This is a term that is intended to indicate that the individual, organisation or government is sequestering as much CO2 as they are releasing in their activities. Leaving aside the myopia of concentrating on just one pollutant and sacrificing all on the altar of net zero, there are a variety of ways that governments, organisations and individuals can strive to achieve this. And one of the most common is planting trees, which we saw in the press releases about an Antarctic expedition, which I will speak about in a moment. Young trees sequester relatively little CO2, and they do not contribute significantly until they have grown to maturity. In the calculations of those who think that they can deal with climate change by effectively investing in planting schemes, trees planted today are unlikely to sequester much carbon for several decades. The pollution that one might put into the atmosphere by our energy use now is not being paid off as we might imagine, and as a result, the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere is not being ameliorated in the rather simplistic way that one might think it is. Global warming won't pause because there is some reduction in CO2 going to happen at some unspecified time in the future. Is this a failure to understand or simple dishonesty? In April 2021, a news headline told me that 2 polar adventurers were planning the first carbon negative expedition to Antarctica. I was intrigued to find what new technology had been developed that could move people over the surface of the planet whilst at the same time sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. Sadly, that wasn't the true story. This was a rather extreme case of offsetting, anticipating future environmental sinning by doing penance in advance in the form of environmental good works. As the Outdoors Magic blog described this, before the young people go, they will pay it forward, not with cash, but by committing to take part in initiatives close to home. This will include rewilding projects, removing plastics from saplings, helping clean rivers, beaches and green spaces. They will also share with others the incredible nature and environment that is on their doorstep, becoming local ambassadors for the environment. The entire team will be planting enough trees to ensure their trip to Antarctica will be 100% carbon neutral and, in time, carbon negative. I leave you to make what you will of that. If you followed the credit crunch in 2008, which sadly seems to be having some echoes in the United States at the moment, you might understand that the global banking system was derailed by complicated financial instruments known as derivatives. These are not money or goods. They are investments in investments, bets about bets. Derivatives created a booming global economy, but they also led to turbulent markets. Credit crunch, that is, the near collapse of the world banking system, and the subsequent economic slump. It seems to me that offsetting, buying future sequestration of CO2, which similarly is neither goods nor money, but investments in future benefits, which can be traded, has rather too much in common with the futures options and derivatives that led to the credit crunch in 2008, certainly for my comfort. The buying and selling of these financial instruments relied heavily on some maths. It's okay, I'm not going to share it with you. Called the Black-Scholes equation. The equation itself wasn't the problem. It was useful. It was precise, and its limitations were clearly stated on the tin. It provided an industry-standard method to assess the likely value of a financial derivative so that they could be traded before they matured. The formula was fine if you used it sensibly and abandoned it when market conditions weren't appropriate. The trouble was its potential for abuse. It allowed derivatives to become commodities that could be traded in their own right. The financial sector called it the Midas formula and saw it as a recipe for making everything turn to gold. But the markets forgot how the story of King Midas ended and used it as a black box embedded in complex computer systems that were blind to whether it was appropriate or not. The systems for trading future carbon sequestration are likely to become ever more complex as international markets in this and related activities develop. Will it, like the global banking system, come to near collapse at some time in the future? If I give you money to plant trees on my behalf, which will sequester carbon at some time in the future, how can I be sure that it will happen? We've already seen that it won't happen immediately, but can I trust that it will ever happen? Or that it will simply be a route to money making by both honest organisations and fraudsters alike? According to their website, Woodland Carbon Code is the quality assurance standard for woodland creation projects in the UK and generates high integrity, independently verified carbon units backed by the government, the forest industry and carbon market experts. The code provides woodland carbon units right here in the UK. The Woodland Carbon Code is internationally recognised for high standards of sustainable forest management and carbon management and is endorsed by ICROA, the global umbrella body for carbon reduction and offset providers in the voluntary market. So that's okay then. But wasn't the system of plenary indulgences endorsed by the Vatican, the global umbrella body for divine services, internationally recognised for high standards in the sin and forgiveness market? For a few things, the price that people pay for something is the full cost of producing it, with the addition of a margin for profit. But for most things, they pay only partially, with the rest being borne by others, such as exploited labour, indirectly, for instance through poorer health of particular groups of people, or belatedly, for instance through taxes to make good damage caused by others. So what do I mean by all of that? In the context of the exploitation of the resources of the earth, to quote Goodin again, environmental inputs are typically common property resources: clean air and water, fisheries, the ozone layer, the climate, are everyone's business and no one's. No one owns these things. There is no one standing to sue you if you take them without paying, nor is there anyone you could pay for permission to impinge on them, even if you wanted to. That fact inevitably gives rise to a divergence between the full social costs created by your actions and the portion of those costs sheeted back to you as private costs to be entered into your own ledger. It is, of course, only the latter sorts of costs to which economically rational agents can be expected to respond. From an economic standpoint, the lower the costs, the more people will consume a particular commodity, and if the producer can get some of their inputs at an unrealistically low cost, or at no cost at all, then they can pass this on with artificially low prices. Where some of the costs of their activities will be borne by others, agents looking only to their own balance sheets will over-engage in these activities. Because some of the costs are external, which is to say are borne by others rather than themselves, agents will undertake more of those activities than they would have done had they been forced to pay their full costs. And if you think that sounds terribly modern, it was written in 1932. It isn't, of course, that clean air and water, fisheries, the ozone layer, the climate, and so on have no cost. It is that the cost is borne by the people who are directly affected by the environmental despoilation that results in treating them as though there were no cost to using them. Even in the case of natural resources that have significant costs in their extraction, such as oil, minerals, timber, the cost of extraction isn't the full cost, since there is often significant environmental damage caused in the extraction, mining for instance, with extensive damage to natural environments, plants, animals, air and water quality, etc. As we've seen repeatedly in these lectures, the remaining cost is frequently borne by the poor and people living in the less developed parts of the world, or through the displacement of indigenous people. In all of this, my main worry is that if we focus too closely on carbon emissions and net zero, we effectively blind ourselves to at least two other things. The wider picture of the widespread environmental, justice and equity harms that an apparently benign change of energy source produces, and the wider picture of the widespread environmental, justice and equity harms that our overconsumption produces. As we have seen, these harms often occur at some distance from where we live and affect peoples, animals and plants and ecosystems that have made little contribution to the causes of these harms. So from all that we have discussed in the last 3 weeks, what might be an appropriate way for us to respond that is guided by our faith and the theology of the Christian Church? That is the hope-filled question for us to address next week, when we ask the question, where do we go from here? Thank you.